While laughter filled a room you never entered, your name quietly became the one conversation nobody expected. Glasses were lifted, stories wandered in every direction, and the person you love smiled the way people often do when they try to hide thoughts they cannot explain. Then, without planning it, one friend spoke with complete honesty. Another nodded. A third finished a sentence that had been waiting far longer than anyone realized. In that ordinary moment, something changed. Not because of the drinks, but because hidden feelings have a strange way of becoming visible when hearts stop pretending. Don't skip, because what surfaced next was not loud or dramatic. It was simple, unexpected, and impossible to ignore. No one in that room was trying to impress anyone anymore. The conversations had become softer, slower, more genuine. Someone looked at the person you love and quietly asked a question they had been holding back for months. Why do you always become different whenever that one person comes up? Silence answered before words ever could. That silence carried more truth than any explanation. Eyes met across the room. A gentle smile appeared. It was as if everyone suddenly understood something that had been unfolding in front of them all along, while only one person remained unaware, you. Then another voice broke the quiet with an observation so small that most people would have missed it. They spoke about the way your name is never rushed, the way conversations somehow circle back to you without anyone forcing them there, the way even ordinary memories seem brighter whenever you become part of the story. The person you love did not argue. They did not laugh it away. Instead, they lowered their eyes for just a moment, as though protecting something far more valuable than pride. Stay till the end. Because that brief silence opened a door that had remained closed for longer than anyone in that room realized. What happened next surprised even the friends who thought they already knew everything. One of them admitted they had been watching from a distance for weeks. Not watching with suspicion, but with curiosity. They had noticed little moments that almost nobody else would notice. A smile that arrived after reading a message. A thoughtful pause whenever your future was mentioned. A quiet confidence that appeared only after hearing something encouraging about you. Piece by piece, they had unknowingly gathered fragments of a picture that even the person you love had never fully assembled. For the first time, the conversation was no longer about romance or guessing what might happen tomorrow. It became something much deeper. Their friends began describing the version of the person they had witnessed whenever your presence entered their life, even indirectly. Calmer. Kinder. More hopeful. More willing to dream about possibilities instead of disappointments. Those words settled gently into the room, and nobody hurried to change the subject. Something important is waiting for you, because the next voice would reveal why those changes had been impossible to hide, and why every person sitting there suddenly realized they had overlooked one remarkable truth about you that the person you love had quietly carried in their heart all along. A quiet laugh drifted across the room, but it carried none of the playfulness it had only moments before. It sounded more like the relief of someone finally admitting what everyone else had already begun to see. One friend leaned forward and said, "You know what surprises me the most?" Every conversation stopped again. Even the person you love looked up, waiting. The answer came gently, without judgment. It's not that you care about them. It's that you've become someone different because of them. Those words settled into the silence like the final piece of a puzzle nobody knew they had been building. The person you love didn't rush to respond. Instead, they traced the edge of the glass with their fingertips, as if searching for the right word somewhere inside that quiet motion. Then came the smallest smile, a smile that seemed to carry memories no one else in the room had lived. Another friend noticed it immediately. "There it is," they whispered. "That's the smile we keep talking about." No one laughed. No one interrupted. Somehow, everyone understood that they were witnessing something too genuine to disturb. Then another unexpected voice entered the conversation. This friend had remained almost completely silent all evening, simply listening. When they finally spoke, every head turned toward them. "Can I tell you something?" they asked. "I've never even met this person. But I feel like I already know them." The room fell completely still. Curious expressions appeared everywhere. "How?" someone asked. The answer was almost unbelievable in its simplicity. "Because every time you tell a story that somehow includes them, your entire outlook changes. You stop speaking about problems. You start speaking about possibilities." For a brief moment, the person you love closed their eyes. It wasn't embarrassment. It wasn't uncertainty. It looked more like the realization that something deeply personal had quietly become visible to everyone else. They had spent so much time trying to keep their feelings private that they never imagined those feelings had already been written into the smallest parts of who they had become. Don't skip, because the next realization would reveal that their friends hadn't only noticed the change. They had quietly compared who they were before you entered their life with who they had become afterward. One friend reached into a pocket and pulled out a phone, not to expose a secret, but to settle a memory. They scrolled through old photos from months earlier. Smiles appeared as everyone looked. "Remember this night?" they asked. The person you love nodded. "You looked happy," another friend admitted, "but not like this." They kept scrolling through more memories until they reached the present. No one needed to explain the difference anymore. It was visible in every expression, every quiet glance, every relaxed smile. Without realizing it, they had been growing into someone more hopeful, and everyone around them had witnessed that gentle transformation. Then came the sentence that changed the atmosphere once again. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was spoken so softly that everyone instinctively leaned closer to hear it. "Maybe," one friend said, "the most beautiful thing about them isn't what they've done, maybe it's who they've helped you become." Those words lingered long after they were spoken. The person you love looked away for just a second, not because they disagreed, but because something inside them had finally been understood without needing to be explained. And just when it seemed the conversation had reached its deepest point, another friend quietly admitted they had been keeping one observation to themselves for a very long time, and what they were about to reveal would make everyone in that room look at your story in an entirely new way. The room had become so still that even the smallest sound seemed to carry meaning. A friend who had spent most of the evening quietly observing finally looked directly at the person you love and said, "I've been waiting for the right moment to tell you this, because I wasn't sure you were ready to hear it." No one reached for another drink. No one checked a phone. Every eye remained fixed on the conversation that had slowly become something far more important than anyone expected. The person you love nodded almost instinctively, as though a part of them already knew what was coming. The friend smiled gently before continuing. "You keep talking about them as though they changed your future, but that's not what happened." A pause followed. "They changed the way you see yourself." The words were simple, yet they seemed to echo through every memory that had been shared that night. For several quiet seconds, the person you love couldn't find a response. Their expression said everything. Sometimes the deepest truths arrive so softly that they leave no room for immediate answers. Another friend leaned back and quietly admitted something no one had heard before. Do you remember when you used to doubt every decision you made? Heads nodded around the room. You questioned yourself constantly. You expected the worst before anything had even happened. They glanced toward the person you love with a warm smile. But somewhere along the way, that changed. We didn't notice it all at once. It happened little by little, until one day we realized the anxious version of you had almost disappeared. The room grew thoughtful. No one could deny it anymore. Then someone laughed, not because anything was funny, but because a forgotten memory suddenly returned. I remember the first time you mentioned their name, they said. You tried to sound casual, but you smiled before you even finished the sentence. Everyone else began remembering their own moments. One recalled how the person you love had become more patient. Another remembered how they had started believing good things could actually happen. Someone else quietly admitted that the kindness they now carried had become contagious, inspiring everyone around them to be a little more understanding with each other. Stay till the end, because the conversation was no longer about hidden feelings. It had become a mirror reflecting changes that had unfolded so gradually no one had appreciated them until this very night. The person you love looked around the room, hearing familiar voices describe a version of themselves they had never stopped to recognize. Sometimes the people closest to us notice our growth long before we do. Then came the one observation that no one expected. A friend who rarely spoke about emotions folded their hands and said, "There's something I've never told anyone." The room became completely silent once again. Every time I saw you talk about them, I wasn't paying attention to your words. The person you love looked surprised. I was watching your eyes. Another pause settled over the room. Your eyes never looked brighter when you talked about achievements, vacations, or plans. They only looked that way when you believed they were happy. No one interrupted. It was impossible to. The person you love slowly lowered their head, not out of embarrassment, but because they finally understood that the smallest details had quietly revealed the biggest truth. They had spent so much time trying to protect their feelings that they never realized those feelings had already become visible through their actions, their patience, and the quiet hope they carried every day. Just when everyone thought the conversation had reached its natural ending, someone sitting near the window spoke for the very first time all evening. They had listened to every word without offering a single opinion. Now they took a slow breath and said, "There's one thing all of you have missed." Every face turned toward them. The room became silent once more. What they were about to reveal wasn't about what the person you love felt for you. It was about something they believed you had quietly done without ever realizing it, and that realization would leave every person in the room seeing your place in this story in an entirely different light. The silence that followed felt different from every pause that had come before. It was no longer the silence of uncertainty. It was the silence that appears when everyone senses that one final thought could change the meaning of everything already said. The friend by the window looked around the room with a calm expression before quietly asking, "Have any of you noticed what never happens whenever this person is mentioned?" The question lingered in the air. Everyone searched their memories, but no answer came immediately. Finally, they continued. No matter how difficult your day has been, no matter how frustrated or discouraged you felt, the moment you begin talking about them, you stop speaking about yourself. The room grew completely still. You start hoping for them instead. You wonder if they're doing well. You hope they're smiling. You hope life is being kind to them. The person you love blinked slowly, as if hearing their own heart described by someone else. They had never realized that the direction of every conversation quietly shifted in exactly the same way. Another friend nodded with quiet certainty. "That's true," they admitted. "We've all seen it." They smiled warmly before adding, "It's almost impossible to stay focused on your own worries once their name enters the conversation." No one laughed this time. There was nothing amusing about the realization. It was simply honest. Sometimes the deepest affection isn't found in grand words. Sometimes it reveals itself in the quiet habit of wishing good things for someone else without expecting anything in return. Don't skip, because the next memory that surfaced had been hidden in plain sight for months. One friend suddenly remembered a conversation from long before this gathering. "There was one evening," they said thoughtfully, "when everyone else had already gone home. They looked directly at the person you love. You stayed behind for a few minutes, and I asked you what made you smile so often lately. The room leaned in. You didn't answer right away. You looked out the window for a long time before saying something I'll never forget." The friend paused, allowing curiosity to grow naturally. "You said, some people remind you that becoming a better person doesn't always happen because someone tells you to. Sometimes it happens because you simply don't want to disappoint the kindness they've shown you." Those words settled gently over everyone. No one tried to explain them away. They were too sincere for that. The person you love slowly covered their face for a brief moment, smiling with quiet humility. They had forgotten saying those words. Their friends never had. The atmosphere softened. The conversation no longer felt like friends uncovering a secret. It felt like people honoring a truth that had quietly grown over time. One by one, they began sharing tiny moments they had never considered important before. A thoughtful pause before sending a message. A peaceful expression after hearing good news about you. A habit of speaking about your strengths instead of your flaws. None of those moments seemed extraordinary on their own. Together, they formed a picture no one could ignore. Then, just as everyone believed the evening had finally reached its conclusion, someone noticed something unexpected. The person you love had been unusually quiet for several minutes, gently turning an object over in their hands beneath the table. A close friend glanced down and recognized it immediately. Their eyes widened, not with shock, but with understanding. They looked back up and whispered, "So that's why you've never been able to let this story go." Every conversation stopped once again. No one in the room knew the full meaning of what they had just noticed, except the friend who had quietly recognized it. They took a slow breath, looked at the person you love with a knowing smile, and said, "I think it's finally time to tell them about the promise you made to yourself the night everything changed." And for the first time that evening, the person you love didn't look away. For a long moment, the person you love simply looked at the small object resting in their hand. No one asked what it was. Somehow, everyone understood that its meaning mattered far more than its appearance. The friend who had noticed it smiled gently and said, "You kept it all this time." A quiet nod was the only reply. That single gesture revealed more than a long explanation ever could. The room became filled with a thoughtful calm. One friend finally spoke. "We always wondered why you never let go of that." The person you love turned the object over once more before answering in a voice almost too soft to hear. "Because every time I thought about giving up, it reminded me of the kind of person I wanted to become." Those words settled deeply. No one expected that answer. They had assumed the object represented a memory. Instead, it represented a decision. Stay till the end. Because the promise hidden inside that decision was something none of them had fully understood until this very moment. The friend who had been quietly listening all evening leaned forward with a warm smile. "Do you remember what you said that night?" they asked. The person you love laughed softly. "Not exactly." The friend nodded. "I do." Everyone waited. "You said that meeting someone truly meaningful doesn't just make you hope they'll stay in your life. It makes you want to become someone worthy of every kind thing they've already inspired inside you." No one interrupted. The words carried no drama, no grand declaration, only quiet sincerity. They felt honest in a way that could not be rehearsed. One by one, the friends began realizing that the biggest change had never been the growing affection. It had been the quiet commitment to become more patient, more understanding, more grateful, and more present because of what your presence represented. Another friend smiled as another memory surfaced. "I think we misunderstood you for a long time." The person you love looked up curiously. "We thought you were waiting for the perfect moment." They shook their head gently. "But you weren't waiting at all. You were growing." A peaceful silence followed. It was the kind of silence that appears when everyone suddenly reaches the same conclusion without needing to debate it. Growth had never been loud. It had happened in ordinary days, in small choices, in conversations no one else would ever remember. Yet together, those moments had quietly rewritten an entire chapter of someone's life. Then the oldest friend in the group spoke for the first time that evening. They rarely offered opinions, which made everyone listen even more carefully. "I've watched all of this from the beginning," they said. "And I think every one of us has been focusing on the wrong question." The room turned toward them. "We've been asking whether they care about this person." A gentle smile appeared. "That answer became obvious months ago." Another pause. "The real question is, what kind of future do they quietly imagine whenever they think about them?" The room fell completely still. Even the person you love didn't answer immediately. Instead, they looked toward the window, where the first light of morning had begun to replace the darkness outside. It felt symbolic somehow, as though the night itself had been patiently waiting for this conversation to reach its deepest point. Then, with complete honesty, they whispered something so unexpected that every friend slowly exchanged glances. "I've never been afraid of what they might think of me." They paused. "I've only ever hoped that one day they'll see the person I've been trying to become." No one spoke after that. There was nothing left to add. The truth everyone had been searching for throughout the night had quietly revealed itself, not through dramatic confessions or extraordinary moments, but through a simple hope carried faithfully over time. And just as the gathering began to wind down, one friend remembered a conversation that had happened weeks earlier. A conversation the person you love believed no one else had overheard. The words spoken that day would connect every quiet clue from this night into one final realization, and it would reveal the one thing they had wanted you to know all along. Morning arrived so quietly that no one noticed the first rays of light slipping through the window. The laughter had faded, the conversations had slowed, yet no one seemed eager to leave. It was as though everyone understood that the evening had not been remembered because of the celebration, it would be remembered because of what had finally been spoken aloud. Then, almost unexpectedly, one friend looked toward the person you love and smiled. "There's something I've carried for weeks," they said. "I wasn't sure if I should ever bring it up." The room grew attentive once again. "It happened on an ordinary afternoon," the friend continued. You didn't know I was nearby. The person you love searched their memory, trying to recall the moment. You were talking to someone who asked you a very simple question. They paused, letting the memory settle before revealing it. They asked, "What is it about them that stays with you even when they're not around?" A gentle silence filled the room. You didn't answer immediately, the friend said. You looked down for a moment, smiled to yourself, and then said something I'll probably remember for the rest of my life. Everyone leaned in. You said, "Some people leave you with memories. They leave me with better habits." No one moved. Those words were so quiet, so genuine, that they seemed to wrap themselves around every conversation from the night before. Suddenly, every little story the friends had shared made sense. The patience they had noticed. The quiet confidence. The kindness that had slowly become part of everyday life. None of it had appeared by accident. Don't skip. Because what happened next surprised even the people who thought they already knew the whole story. One friend laughed softly and shook their head. "I always thought you admired them because of who they were." The person you love smiled. "I do." The friend nodded. "No, it's more than that now." They looked around the room before finishing their thought. You admire the person you've become because they entered your life. A warm stillness followed. No one tried to add anything dramatic. The truth didn't need decoration. Sometimes the most meaningful realization is also the simplest one. Then another friend quietly admitted something that had never been shared before. "I owe them a thank you." The person you love looked surprised. "Why?" they asked. The friend smiled. "Because before they became part of your story, you used to rush through life. You rarely slowed down long enough to notice the people sitting beside you. Somewhere along the way, that changed. You became more present. You listened more. You encouraged people more. You reminded all of us that small moments matter." The room filled with quiet agreement. For the first time all night, the conversation wasn't only about what you meant to the person you love. It was about the quiet influence that had gently reached everyone connected to them. One by one, their friends began remembering tiny acts of kindness they had received over the past months. Encouraging words, thoughtful check-ins, unexpected patience. They realized those moments had become more frequent after your name had quietly become part of the person's everyday thoughts. Something important is waiting for you, because the final realization had not yet been spoken. As everyone prepared to leave, one friend paused beside the doorway and turned back. "There is one last thing," they said. "I don't think they ever intended for you to hear this." The person you love looked up, curious. The friend smiled gently before continuing. Every time someone asked what they hoped would happen in the future, they never talked about perfect timing, perfect circumstances, or perfect endings. A thoughtful pause followed. They always said the same thing. The room became completely still. "I just hope that if our paths ever cross again in the right moment, they'll recognize that every quiet lesson, every small change, and every step forward was never about proving something." Another gentle pause. "It was simply my way of honoring the good they quietly awakened in me." Those words remained in the room long after everyone had walked away. And as the door slowly closed behind the last friend, the person you love glanced once more at the small object they had carried throughout the evening, smiled with quiet gratitude, and whispered one final sentence that no one else was meant to hear: a sentence that would bring this entire story to its most heartfelt and unforgettable conclusion. The room was empty now. Chairs stood where they had been left, a few quiet echoes lingered in the air, and the first light of morning stretched across the floor. For the first time all night, there were no questions, no observations, and no conversations waiting to unfold. Only the person you love remained, holding that small object in one hand while looking out the window as if they had finally reached a place they had been walking toward for a very long time. They smiled. Not because everything was certain, but because something inside them finally was. In the stillness, they whispered the sentence no one else had heard. I hope they never realize how much they changed my life, unless one day they can also see how grateful I am for it. The words disappeared into the quiet morning, but their meaning stayed behind. A few minutes later, footsteps returned. One friend had forgotten their keys and walked back inside. They paused at the doorway, unintentionally hearing the final words. They didn't interrupt. They didn't pretend to clear their throat or make their presence known. Instead, they simply smiled to themselves. When the person you love finally noticed them, there was a brief moment of surprise. I didn't know you were still here. The friend shook their head gently. I wasn't supposed to hear that. A short silence followed before they added something that brought the entire night together. You know what I've realized? The person you love looked at them curiously. We spent hours talking about what you feel. Another pause. But that's not what impressed me. The friend stepped a little closer. What impressed me is that every story we shared tonight was about kindness, patience, hope, and quiet growth. They smiled warmly. That's how I know this is real. The person you love lowered their eyes for a moment, letting those words settle. Then the friend continued. People often think the strongest connections are built through dramatic moments. They shook their head. I don't believe that anymore. I think they're built through ordinary days, the ones where someone inspires you to become a little more understanding, a little more grateful, and a little more like the person you've always wanted to be. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to prove. Nothing left to defend. Only quiet appreciation for a journey that had unfolded one small step at a time. As they walked outside together, the morning felt different. Not because the world had changed overnight, but because they had. The friend glanced over with a thoughtful smile. If you ever meet them again. They paused. Don't tell them about tonight. The person you love looked surprised. Why not? The friend smiled. Because they don't need to know every conversation we had. They only need to experience the person you've become. Those words stayed with them long after they parted ways. And somewhere, without realizing it, your story and theirs continued moving forward, not through grand promises or perfect timing, but through quiet choices, honest hearts, and the kind of growth that leaves a lasting mark on everyone it touches. Sometimes the most meaningful thing another person gives us isn't an answer. It's a reason to become the best version of ourselves. And perhaps that was the truth their friends had been trying to reveal all along. Not that you had changed their future, but that you had gently changed the way they walked toward it. The night had ended. The conversation had ended. But the quiet hope born in that room would continue long after the last light faded, reminding them that the most beautiful stories are not written in a single unforgettable moment. They are written, day by day, through kindness that is remembered, growth that is noticed, and gratitude that never asks to be seen.